Today, it's going to be a quick reading. We've made it to the very last of the four chapters of this essay, and this one's on faith. The actual title specifically is Science and Faith. So we've been through a lot. When we finish this, obviously we're probably going to want to chat a little bit, and then we could either end it after a short reading, or we could feasibly read a 20-page Socratic dialogue between Max Planck, Albert Einstein, and a science journalist named something Frank Murphy. So you guys let me know how you feel, and it could go either way. Let me do a screen share. How do I? Here it is. Okay. So, who would like to round out this little gestalt we've been working through? Quan, you want to?
Okay, I can do it.
All right.
Yeah, sure. Okay, let's begin. Okay, science and faith. A vast volumes of experiences reaches each one of us in the course of a year. Such is the progress made in the various means of communication that new impressions from far and near rush upon us in a never-ending stream. It is true that many of them are forgotten as quickly as they arrive, and that every trace of them is often effaced within a day. And it is as well that it should be so. If it were otherwise, modern man would be fairly suffocated under the weight of different impressions. Yet every person who wishes to lead more than an ephemeral intellectual existence must be impelled by the very variety of these kaleidoscopic changes to seek for some element of permanence, for some lasting intellectual possession to afford him a point d'appui in the confusing claims of everyday life. In the younger generation, this impulse manifests itself in a passionate desire for a comprehensive philosophy of the world, a desire which looks for satisfaction in groping attempts, turning in every direction where peace and refreshment for a weary spirit is believed to reside. It is the church whose function it would be to meet such aspirations. But in these days, it demands for an unquestioning belief serve rather to repel the doubters. The latter have recourse to more or less dubious substitutes and hasten to throw themselves into the arms of one or other of the many prophets who appear preaching new gospels. It is surprising to find how many people, even of the educated classes, allow themselves to be fascinated by these new religions. Beliefs which vary from the obscurest mysticism to the crudest superstition. It would be easy to suggest that a philosophy of the world might be reached from a scientific basis. But such a suggestion is usually rejected by those seekers on the ground that the scientific view is bankrupt. There is an element of truth in this suggestion, and indeed, it is entirely correct if the term science is taken in the traditional and still surviving sense, where it implies a reliance on the understanding. Such a method, however, proves that those who adopt it have no sense of real science. The truth is very different. Anyone who has taken part in the building up of a branch of science is well aware from personal experience that every endeavor in this direction is guided by an unpretentious but essential principle. This principle is faith, a faith which looks ahead. It is said that science has no preconceived ideas. There is no saying that has been more thoroughly or more disastrously misunderstood. It is true that every branch of science must have an empirical foundation, but it is equally true that the essence of science does not consist in this raw material, but in the manner in which it is used. The material always is incomplete. It consists of a number of parts, which, however numerous, are discrete, and this is equally true of the tabulated figures of the natural sciences and of the various documents of the intellectual sciences. The material must therefore be completed, and this must be done by filling the gaps. And this, in turn, must be done by means of associations of ideas. And associations of ideas are not the work of the understanding, but the offspring of the investigator's imagination, an activity which may be described as faith or more cautiously as a working hypothesis. The essential point is that its content, in one way or another, goes beyond the data of experience. The chaos of individual masses cannot be wrought into a cosmos without some harmonizing force, and similarly, the disjointed data of experience can never furnish a veritable science without the intelligent interference of a spirit actuated by faith. The question now arises whether this deeper view of the various sciences can provide us with a philosophy of the world fit to be applied to the problems of life. The best answer to this question is furnished by reference to certain great scientists who accepted this view and who, in fact, found that it rendered them this service. Among many other investigators whose straitened existence was rendered supportable and even illustrious by science, I would mention in the first place Johann Kepler. Looked at from without, the whole of his life was hampered by penury, disappointments, and distress. He was by poverty oppressed. In the last year of his life, he was compelled to appeal to the Diet at Regensburg for payment of the imperial pension, then long overdue. Perhaps his greatest trial came when he was forced to defend his mother against a charge of witchcraft. And what supported him in all this trouble and rendered him capable of work was the science he served, not the figures relating to his astronomical observations, but the belief which he drew from them in the realm of rational laws in the universe. It is instructive to compare his case with that of his master and chief, Tycho Brahe. The latter had the same scientific knowledge and disposed of the same observed facts, What he lacked was faith in the eternal laws, and so it came about that Tycho Brahe remained one meritorious investigator among others, while Kepler became the founder of modern astronomy. Another name occurring in this connection is that Julius Robert Mayer, the discoverer of the mechanical heat equivalent. Mayer was not oppressed by financial troubles as Kepler was, but he suffered all the more from the neglect of his theory of the conservation of energy. In the middle of last century, every scientist displayed the greatest suspicion of everything that had a flavor of natural philosophy. Yet Maya remained undismayed by the silence with which he was met and found consolation not so much in his knowledge as in his faith. In the end, he lived to find the representatives of his Department of Science, the Society of German Naturalists and Physicists, among them Hermann Helmholtz, giving public expression to the recognition which had so long been denied him. This was at the annual meeting of 1869 at Innsbruck. We find then in these and many similar instances an active faith at work, and we see that this faith is the power which gives their real effectiveness to the individual data of science. We may even go to a step further and claim that a prophetic faith in the deeper harmony can render valuable services at an earlier stage, the stage of gathering the data. This faith points the way and sharpens the senses. An historian looking for documents in the archives and studying what he discovers, or an experimenter who pursues his work in the laboratory and scrutinizes his results, frequently find the progress of his work facilitated, more especially when he comes to distinguish essentials from unessentials, if he possesses a more or less deliberate intellectual attitude which guides his investigations and serves to interpret the results. His experience then resembles that of a mathematician who discovers and formulates a new proposition before he can prove it. There still remains a danger, and one which is perhaps the gravest that can lie in wait for the investigator. It should not be passed over in this connection. It consists of the fact that the given data may be falsely interpreted or even ignored. If this happens, science becomes a falsehood, an empty structure which collapses at the first shock. Innumerable scientists, both young and old, have succumbed to this danger in their enthusiasm for a scientific conviction. The danger is as grave today as ever it was, and the only remedy against it consists in respect for facts. The more fruitful a thinker's imagination is, the more careful he should be never to forget that the different facts invariably form the foundation without which science cannot exist. And the more carefully must he ask himself whether he is treating them with due respect. It is only when we have planted our feet on the firm ground, which can be won only with the help of the experience of real life, that we have a right to feel secure in surrendering to our belief in a philosophy of the world based upon a faith in the rational ordering of this world. End of chapter, and I think end of book. No,
End of book, indeed. Yes. What do you guys think?
uh, wow. About the last chapter, I think it's common sense in the first sense, in the ordinary sense, but also common sense in the meaning of Larouche,
Hmm.
in this the dialectics between the forms that we try to bring into intellectual concepts, but also with the facts of nature as given by sense perception.
Mm-hmm.
But that those data of sense perception needs to be organized, directed precisely by the idea. I think that Planck used the word belief, but I would say by the idea that there is a harmony and order in the universe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Even even the word cosmos means harmony or order.
Mm. That's true. That's a really cool. Yeah, I forgot about that. This idea as well of the two states of reality that he's been playing with this whole time, that's been weaving itself through these four sections, is how
Yeah,
do they relate? And I love what you said, because they're these great scientists always had an idea of the mathematical ideal world that we don't find in this world of material forces and things that's in constant flux. But they know that there's a connection between the two, but it's so many of them try to artificially force one onto the other, either shape their idea of the immortal eternal forms that Plato talks about, that higher reality. They try
yeah,
to shape their idea of it based on the fluctuating relativity of the world that they live in, or they do the opposite and they try to assume that the world that they live in is being organized by these artificially static ideas, right, of circles and squares and things like that. And I this example that he gave of Tycho Brahe, or Tycho Brahe,
yeah,
is really interesting compared to Kepler, because if anybody's ever seen Tycho Brahe's model of the solar system, it's like this guy did have all the data that Kepler did. He had all of the mathematical and astronomical knowledge that Kepler had. And, Tycho was sort of Kepler's employer for a while until he died in like 1602. Um, but this was his model. Like, he took all of this great data he had and he plugged it into a model that had these perfect, it conformed to his naive idea of the perfect forms of circles, and and he had the earth in the middle. So I mean, he had the earth in the middle, and every planet goes around the sun, but the sun is going around the earth. And according to Tycho's model, it actually matches up with what your observational data shows you within a really high degree. But
yeah,
despite the fact that it nearly matches what you see, the model kind of works. It's totally wrong. It's absurd. And it took a Kepler to come in who had a higher faith in the rational. Because Kepler was like, well, I believe in God. Why would God have made a universe which is so unnecessarily complicated or absurd? why why would he have, if, because you're forcing these circles that you're saying are must be there because God is perfect and the most perfect shape is circles. And so you're just saying that, but it forces all of these other contradictions to occur, like these mathematical, you know, mathematical points called equants that have no physical reality. They're just there mathematically because it conveniences your model, and you can't prove that it's true. And Kepler had a higher abiding faith that allowed him to finally break out of this model and use the same data to discover a truth that Tycho was incapable of seeing. So yeah, I really appreciated that.
Yeah. Well, once again, it's another idea, the idea of beauty. When it's so complicated, it's not beautiful. Okay, so
Yeah.
if it is not beautiful, let's try to find something else.
Mm, that's good. Very good point. Yeah, beautiful and reasonable at the same time, right?
Yeah.
Because sometimes things, what you could sacrifice beauty for reason, or you could sacrifice reason for beauty, but to get a balance of both, where they both are their best, it's really what the real scientist should be aiming for.
Mm,
Which is nice that Planck is even saying, like, these people who disparage science, even amongst the educated class, who are falling into esotericism and things of an artificially superstitious nature.
yeah.
He's like, they disparage science, and they're kind of right. If you define science as just being the understanding and nothing else, they have reason to do what they're doing. But if you define science as something more, the way he's talking about it, he's like, well, they're wrong to do that.
Well, I think it's one of the sure sign of the decline of a civilization when both ideas of beauty and reason are artificially separated
Mm,
because they are naturally together.
mm, mm-hmm,
And I think it's part of also a certain agenda to provoke that decline or to accelerate that decline, or simply the result of a natural decline for complex reasons.
mm, mm-hmm. Yeah, right. What what I think we could do. By the way, if anybody has not read Helen Keller's essay on optimism, her philosophy of optimism, where she cites Leibniz as well as Plato, and she's a young girl who lost her sense of hearing and sight when she was, like, a few months old, but she developed this incredible intellect by the time she was an early teenager, and she could speak 6 or 7 languages, and was teaching Shakespeare and, like, just doing writing poetry and several books, like, incredible soul. But her essay on the philosophy of optimism, maybe we could read that eventually. But it really it reminds me very much of the ideas that Planck is getting at, in especially in this last chapter, because she's like, well, faith, like, what people tell me that I should be more realistic, but it's like, if I was realistic and pragmatic and cynical, ultimately, because the world is a cynical place, and I was born, I lost my sense of hearing and sight. It's a very dark world. Then I would not have achieved anything that I achieved. So
Mm.
they're like, your choice to be optimistic or to be pessimistic will determine what you find or don't find in the course of your life, right? What you it's sort of like a Pygmalion effect.
Yes.
Mm,
Another expression for faith is confidence in life.
mm, mm. Yeah, right. With your idea of enthusiasm.
Yeah, yeah.
That being said, it is. We finished this way earlier than I expected. I thought we were going to go on for a little bit longer, but I was wrong. So, do you guys want to read the 20-page Socratic dialogue between Planck and Einstein?
Yeah,
Yeah,
definitely.
yeah. Let's do it.
All right. Okay. So the 3 characters in this play. This is the epilogue of Where Is Science Going, which is Planck's book. It's a little book, 200 pages long. You can get the full thing on archive.org. And he wrote this in 1932, 3 years before the philosophy of physics, which we just finished. And at the end of it, there's this wonderful little dialogue. And I think that this dialogue inspired him to expound upon and unpack a lot of the core ideas that he did later, 3 years later, in what we just read. So Murphy is a science journalist. Einstein, we know Einstein, and Planck. So, and Einstein wrote a beautiful introduction to this book too, on Planck as a man of faith, which I'll just put this book as a whole as a link in the description box of this video if people are watching this online and they want to read that. So Murphy, Yorika, would you like to be Murphy?
I think it's very hard for me to read from my tablet, so I'll let Gerald and Kwan do it.
Okay, so Jerry, you can be Einstein. Kwan, since you were being Planck, you can keep being Planck.
Okay.
And I will be Murphy.
Okay.
All right.
Okay.
So there's a note here that says the following is an abridgment of a stenograph report made by an attendant secretary during various conversations. Huh, okay. Let me ask, just make sure, can everybody see the words pretty well?
Yeah.
Okay, maybe I can make it a bit better. Can I do it?
Nope, the other way.
Yeah, it's pretty good. If I zoom. Okay. Yeah.
Okay, that's good.
Much better.
Awesome. Murphy, okay. I've been collaborating with our friend Planck on a book which deals principally with the problem of causation and the freedom of the human will.
Einstein. Honestly, I cannot understand what people mean when they talk about the freedom of the human will. I have a feeling, for instance, that I will something or other, but what relation this has with freedom, I cannot understand at all. I feel that I will to light my pipe, and I do it. But how can I connect this up with the idea of freedom? What is behind the act of willing to light the pipe? Another act of willing? Schopenhauer once said, Der Mensch kann, was will, kann aber nicht wollen, was will. Man can do what he wills, but he cannot will what he wills.
But it is now the fashion in physical science to attribute something like free will even to the routine process of inorganic nature.
That nonsense is not merely nonsense, it is objectionable nonsense.
Well, of course, the scientists give it the name of indeterminism.
Look here. Indeterminism is quite an illogical concept. What do they mean by indeterminism? Now, if I say that the average lifespan of a radioactive atom is such and such, that is a statement which expresses a certain order. Gesetzlichkeit. But this idea does not of itself involve the idea of causation. We call it the law of averages, but not every such law need have a causal significance. At the same time, if I say that the average lifespan of such an atom is indeterminate in the sense of being not caused, then I am talking nonsense. I can say that I shall meet you tomorrow at some indeterminate time, but this does not mean that time is not determined. Whether I come or not, the time will come. Here, there is a question of confounding the subjective with the objective world. The indeterminism which belongs to quantum physics is a subjective indeterminism. It must be related to something, else indeterminism has no meaning. And here it is related to our inability to follow the course of individual atoms and forecast their activity. To say that the arrival of a train in Berlin is indeterminate is to talk nonsense, unless you say in regard to what it is indeterminate. If it arrives at all, it is determined by something, and the same is true of the course of atoms.
In what sense, then, do you apply determinism to nature? In the sense that every event in nature proceeds from another event, which we call the cause.
I should hardly put it that way. In the first place, I think that much of the misunderstanding encountered in all this question of causation is due to the rather rudimentary formulation of the causal principle which has been in vogue until now. When Aristotle and the scholastics defined what they meant by a cause, the idea of objective experiment in the scientific sense had not yet arisen. Therefore, they were content with defining the metaphysical concept of cause. And the same is true of Kant. Newton himself seems to have realized that this pre-scientific formulation of the causal principle would prove insufficient for modern physics. And Newton was content to describe the regular order in which events happen in nature, and to construct his synthesis on the basis of mathematical laws. Now, I believe that events in nature are controlled by a much stricter and more closely binding law than we suspect today, when we speak of one event being the cause of another. Our concept here is confined to one happening within one time section. It is dissected from the whole process. Our present rough way of applying the causal principle is quite superficial. We are like a child who judges a poem by the rhyme and knows nothing of the rhythmic pattern. Or we are like a juvenile learner at the piano, just relating one note to that which immediately precedes or follows. To an extent, this may be very well when one is dealing with very simple and primitive compositions, but it will not do for the interpretation of a Bach fugue. Quantum physics has presented us with very complex processes, and to meet them, we must further enlarge and refine our concept of causality.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. You'll have a hard job of it because you'll be going out of fashion. If you will permit me to make a little speech, I shall do so, not so much because I like to listen to my own talk, though of course I do. He's Irish. What Irishman doesn't? But rather because I should like to have your reactions to it.
Gavis.
The Greeks made their workings of fate or destiny the basis of their drama. And drama in those days was a liturgical expression of the profound irrationality perceiving consciousness. It was not merely a discussion, like a Shavian play. You remember the tragedy of Atreus, where fate, or the ineluctable sequence of cause and effect, is the sole, simple thread on which the drama hangs.
Fate or destiny and the principle of causation are not the same thing.
I know that. But scientists live in the world just like other people. Some of them go to political meetings and the theater, and mostly all that I know, at least here in Germany, are readers of current literature. They cannot escape the influence of the milieu in which they live, and that milieu at the present time is characterized largely by a struggle to get rid of the causal chain in which the world has entangled itself.
But isn't mankind always struggling to get rid of that causal chain?
Yes, but that is not the point. That is not to the point just at the moment. Anyhow, I doubt if the politician ever contemplates the consequences of the causal sequence he sets afoot by his foolishness. He is too nimble himself and can slip through the links. Macbeth was not a politician, and that is where he failed. He realized that the assassination could not trammel up the consequence but he did not think of how to escape from the sequential shackles until it was too late. And this is because he was not a politician. My point here is that there is a universal recognition at the moment of this inexorable sequence. People are realizing what Bernard Shaw told them long ago, which of course has been told on innumerable occasions previously when he wrote Caesar and Cleopatra. You remember Caesar's speech to the Queen of Egypt after her orders to slay Photinus had been carried out, though Caesar had guaranteed his safety. "Do you hear," says Caesar, "those knockers at your gate are also believers in vengeance and in stabbing. You have slain their leader. It is right that they shall slay you. If you doubt it, ask your 4 counselors here, and they, in the name of right, shall I not slay them for murdering their queen, and shall be slain in my turn by their countrymen as the invader of their fatherland?" Oh, sorry. "And then, in the name of right, shall I not slay them for murdering their queen, and be slain in turn by their countrymen as the invader of their fatherland? Can Rome do less than slay these slayers too, or show the world how Rome avenges her sons and her honor? And so, to the end of history, murder shall breed murder, always in the name of right and honor and peace, until the gods are tired of blood and create a race that shall understand." People realize this terrible truth nowadays, not indeed because they see that blood will have blood, but because they see that in robbing your neighbor, you rob yourself. For robbery will have robbery, just as blood will have blood. The so-called victors in the World War robbed the vanquished, and they now know that in doing so they robbed themselves. So now we have a condition of all-around misery. People at large see that, but they haven't the courage to face it, and they race like Macbeth to the witch's cauldron. In this case, unfortunately, science is one of the ingredients thrown into the cauldron to give them the solvent they are looking for. I'm going to keep reading my normal voice because I'm not doing a good job. Instead of boldly admitting to the mess, the tragedy, the crime, everybody wants to try to prove himself innocent and looks for the proof by trying to find an alibi for the consequences of his own deeds. Look at that string of hungry people coming to your door every day for bread. Able-bodied fellows who want to exercise man's privilege, which is to work. You have them also parading the streets of London with their distinguished conduct medals on their breasts, shouting for bread. And you have the same in New York and Chicago and Rome and Turin. The comfortable person who sits in his easy chair says to himself, "This has nothing to do with us." And he says that because he knows it has. Then he takes up his popular writers of physics and gives a sigh of contentment when he is told that nature knows no such thing as the laws of consequences. What more do you want? Here is science, and science is the modern counterpart of religion. It is your comfortable bourgeois who has endowed scientific institutions and laboratories. And, say what you will, scientists would not be human if they did not, at least unconsciously, share in the same spirit.
Ach, das kann man nicht sagen.
He says, that man can never know, cannot know. Yes, that can man very well say. You remember your own picture of the self-seekers in the temple of science, whom you admit have built even a great portion of the structure. Well, you acknowledge that only a few have found favor with the angel of God. I am inclined to think that the struggle of science at the present moment is the effort to keep its thought scheme clear of the confusion which the popular spirit would bring into it. It is much the same struggle as the old theologians had. At the Renaissance, however, they succumbed to the fashion of the time and introduced foreign ideas and methods into their science, which finally resulted in the scholastic breakup. The decline of scholasticism dates from the time when the mob started running after philosophers and theologians. Remember how they rushed helter-skelter to hear Epilogue in Paris? Though it is obvious that they could not understand his distinctions. Public flattery was more the cause of his downfall than any merely private influences. He would not have been human if he had not been tempted to think himself above his science, and he succumbed to the temptation. I am not so sure that many scientists are not in his place today. Some of the glistening webs of fancy that they weave seem very much akin to the sophistic distinctions of the scholastic decadence. The older philosophers and theologians were aware of this danger, and they contrived to offset it. They had their esoteric bodies of doctrine, which were disclosed only to the initiated. We have the same sort of protection evidenced in other branches of culture today. The Catholic Church has widely maintained its ritual and dogmas within the forms and formulations of a language which the populace does not understand. The sociologists and financial experts have a jargon that is all their own, and it saves them from being found out. That's funny. The majesty of the law is upheld in like manner, and the medical craft could not survive if it prescribed its medicines and described its diseases in the vernacular. But all these do not matter, because none of all these sciences or arts or crafts is vital. Physical science is organically vital at the moment, and for that reason it seems to be suffering from...
But I can think of nothing more objectionable than the idea of science for the scientists. It is almost as bad as art for the artists and religion for the priests. There is certainly something in what you say, and I believe that the present fashion of applying the axioms of physical science to human life is not only entirely a mistake, but is also something reprehensible in it. I find that the problem of causality, which is today under discussion in physics, is not a new phenomenon in the field of science. The method which is being used in quantum physics has already had to be applied in biology, because the biological processes in nature could not in themselves be traced so that their connection would be clear. And for that reason, biological rules have always been of a statistical character. And I do not understand why so much bother ought to be made if the principle of causation should undergo a restriction in modern physics, for this is not a new situation at all.
Of course, it has not brought about any new situation, but biological science is not vital in the way that physical science is vital at the moment. People are no longer very much interested whether we were descended from monkeys or not, except certain animal enthusiasts who think the idea rather rough on the monkey. And there is not that public interest in biology such that there was in the time of Darwin and Huxley. The center of gravity of the public interest has shifted to physics. That is why the public reacts in its own way to any new formulation in physics.
I am entirely in agreement with our friend Planck in regard to the stand which he has taken on this principle. But you must remember what Planck has said and written. He admits the impossibility of applying the causal principle to the inner processes of atomic physics under the present state of affairs. But he has set himself definitely against the thesis that from this Unbrauchbarkeit, or inapplicability, we are to conclude that the process of causation does not exist in external reality. Planck has really not taken up any definite standpoint here. He has only contradicted the emphatic assertions of some quantum theorists, and I agree fully with him. And when you mention people who speak of such a thing as free will in nature, it is difficult for me to find a suitable reply. The idea is, of course, preposterous.
And for anybody at this point who might be listening to this recording online, go back and either listen to part 2 or part 3 of the reading of Planck's Philosophy of Physics that's on our YouTube channel, or just read Planck's Philosophy of Physics as a PDF under this description of the description box, where Planck develops his idea of redefining causality from being what people popularly believe it to be, like the thing which precedes an event. You could say caused the event, but like Einstein just said here, it's kind of, that's a naive idea. It's like a kid thinking that, you know, the note that came after the first note he did was caused by the previous note. And he's like, that might work for a simple melody on a simple level, but that's actually not true. There's a different cause when you're performing on a piano, something like a Bach fugue. So there's a totally different idea, and Planck gets across that the problem is that we've artificially put a wall between subjective and objective, right? And he makes the point that when looked at objectively, you could say that things are determined and freedom of will is not so present, but when looked at subjectively, there is a freedom. It is internally free. So freedom is something which is a state of being, right? It's like Kepler had a freedom, a creative liberty inside of his soul, such that even though he died poor, like Planck said at the end of the last essay, he died with a lot of material constraints physically bounding him. He was still much more free than the rich Tycho Brahe. So we have this coexistence of freedom and law, and duty and freedom that exists, and to the degree that you don't acknowledge that coexistence, that'll seem like an unsolvable problem. So, very important essay for people to read. So yeah, Murphy says, you would agree then, I imagine, that physics gives no ground whatsoever for this extraordinary application of what we may, for convenience's sake, call Heisenberg's principle of indeterminacy.
Of course, I agree.
But then you know that certain English physicists of very high standing indeed, and at the same time very popular, have promulgated with emphasis what you and Planck call, and many others with you, unwarranted conclusions.
You must distinguish between the physicist and the literateur when both professions are combined into one. In England, you have a great English literature and a great discipline of style. What I mean is that there are scientific writers in England who are illogical and romantic in their popular books, but in their scientific work, they are acute logical reasoners. What the scientist aims at is to secure a logically consistent transcript of nature. Logic is for him what the laws of proportion and perspective are to the painter. And I believe with Henry Poincaré that science is worth pursuing because it reveals the beauty of nature. And here I will say that the scientist finds his reward in what Henri Poincaré calls the joy of comprehension, and not in the possibilities of application to which any discovery of his may lead. The scientist, I think, is content to construct a perfectly harmonious picture on a mathematical pattern, and he is quite satisfied to connect up the various parts of it through mathematical formulas without asking whether and how far these are a proof that the law of causation functions in the external world.
Did I? Yeah, okay. Let me call your attention, Professor, to a phenomenon that happens sometimes down here on the lake when you are sailing your yacht. Of course, it doesn't happen very often on the placid waters of Caput, because you have flat lands all around and therefore no sudden wind squalls. But if you are sailing close to the wind on one of our northern lakes, you are always running the risk of kneeling over rather suddenly under the onslaught of an unexpected air current. What I'm coming to is this, that I think the positivist might easily get in his shot here and hit you between wind and water. If you say that the scientist is content to secure mathematical logic in his mental construct, then you will quickly be quoted in support of the subjective idealism championed by modern scientists such as Sir Arthur Eddington.
But that would be ridiculous.
Of course, it would be an unjustifiable conclusion, but you have already been widely quoted in the British press as subscribing to the theory that the outer world is a derivative of consciousness. I have had to call this to the attention of a friend of mine in England, Mr. Joad, who has written an excellent book called Philosophical Aspects of Science. The book is a contradiction of the attitudes taken up by Sir Arthur Eddington and Sir James Jeans, and your name is mentioned as corroborating their theories.
No physicist believes that. Otherwise, he wouldn't be a physicist. Neither do the physicists you have mentioned. You must distinguish between what is a literary fashion and what is a scientific pronouncement. These men are genuine scientists, and their literary formulations must not be taken as expressive of their scientific convictions. Why should anybody go to the trouble of gazing at the stars if he did not believe that the stars were really there? Here I am entirely at one with Planck. We cannot logically prove the existence of the external world, any more than you can logically prove that I am talking with you now or that I am here. But you know that I am here, and no subjective idealist can persuade you to the contrary.
That point, of course, was fully elucidated long ago by the scholastics, and I cannot help thinking that much of the confusion in the 19th century and today would have been spared if the break with the philosophical tradition had not been so abysmal in the 17th century. And here he's referring to the Enlightenment break from the Renaissance period. The scholastics put the case for the modern physicist very clearly in describing mental images of external reality as existing fundamentaliter in re, formaliter in mente. Quan, what does that mean?
It means that it exists truly in reality, but in the mind, under the form, in forms, in the mental space.
Gotcha. Right. Is this? I'm not sure if this is Murphy now. No, I don't know who this is.
No, no, that's a transition.
Okay, you want to read that, Quan, since Planck doesn't seem to be playing a role?
Yeah, I forget now the discussion on this particular topic brought off. And in the stenogram, the next paragraph opens with Planck. And there has recently been a great deal of, and we need to change the page, of discussion in the press. I said to him about what is called the bankruptcy of science. It is that the general public here feels somehow or other that all the great scientific achievements of Germany seem to have been of no avail in securing the prestige of the nation abroad. Of course, there is the larger background also of the general skepticism, which is a universal feature of the world in our day. This attacks religion and art and literature as well as science. So now it's Planck speaking. The churches appear to be unable to supply the spiritual anchorage which so many people are seeking. And so the people turn in other directions. The difficulty which organized religions finds in appealing to the people nowadays is that it appeals necessarily demands the believing spirit, or what is generally called faith. In an all-round state of skepticism, this appeal receives only a poor response. Hence, you have a number of prophets offering substitute wares.
Do you think that science in this particular might be a substitute for religion?
Not to a skeptical state of mind, for science demands also the believing spirit. Anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the temple of science are written the word, ye must have faith. It is a quality which the scientist cannot dispense with. The man who handles a bulk of results obtained from an experimental process must have an imaginative picture of the law that he's pursuing. He must embody this in an imaginary hypothesis. The reasoning facilities alone will not help him forward a step, for no order can emerge from that chaos of elements unless there is the constructive quality of mind which builds up the order by a process of elimination and choice. Again and again, the imaginary plan on which one attempts to build up that order breaks down, and then we must try another. This imaginative vision and faith in the ultimate success are indispensable. The pure rationalist has no place here.
How far has this been verified in the lives of great scientists? Take the case of Kepler, whose 300th anniversary we were celebrating, you remember, that evening when Einstein gave his lecture at the Academy of Science. Wasn't there something about Kepler having made certain discoveries, not because he set out after them with his constructive imagination, but rather because he was concerned about the dimensions of wine barrels and was wondering which shapes would be the most economic containers?
Those stories circulate in regard to nearly everybody whose name is before the public. As a matter of fact, Kepler is a magnificent example of what I have been saying. He was always hard up. He had to suffer disillusion after disillusion, and even had to beg for the payment of the arrears of the imperial pension, probably,
Close.
of his salary. Yeah, of his salary by the Reichstag in Regensburg.
How did you know?
He had, yeah, well, maybe the other chapter. He had to undergo the agony of having to defend his own mother against a public indictment of witchcraft. But one can realize in studying his life that what rendered him so energetic and tireless and productive was the profound faith he had in his own science, not the belief that he could eventually arrive at an arithmetical synthesis of his astronomical observation, but rather, I'm sorry. Okay, but rather the profound faith in the existence of a definite plan behind the whole of creation. It was because he believed in that plan that his labor was found by him to be worthwhile, and also in this way, by never allowing his faith to flag, his work enliven and enlighten his dreary life. Compare him with Tycho de Brahe. Brahe had the same material under his hands as Kepler, and even better opportunities, but he remained only a researcher because he did not have the same faith in the existence, the eternal laws of creation. Brahe remained only a researcher, but Kepler was the creator of the new astronomy.
It's always worth rereading that again and again.
Yeah, exactly. Another name that occurs to me in this connection is that of Julius Robert Mayer. His discoveries was hardly noticed because in the middle of the last century, there was a great deal of skepticism, even among educated people, about the theories of natural philosophies. Mayer kept on and on, not because of what he had discovered and could prove, but because of what he believed. It was only in 1869 that the Society of German Physicists and
oh, sorry.
That's okay. And physicians with Helmholtz at their head recognized Mayer's work.
You have often said that the progress of science consists in the discovery of a new mystery the moment one thinks that something fundamental has been solved. The quantum theory has opened up this big problem of causation. And I really do not think that the matter can be answered very categorically. Of course, it is easy enough to see that those who take up a definite stand and say that there is no such thing as causality are illogical, in the sense that you cannot prove any such statement either by experiment or by appeal to the direct diktats of consciousness and common sense in its defense. But all the same, it seems to me that the burden is on the determinists, at least to indicate the direction in which the old formulation of causality will have to be revised in order to meet the needs of modern science. And this right there is the challenge that Planck takes on, that he then develops in his essay that we just read.
Yeah, exactly. So Planck answer, as to the first point, that about the discovery of new mysteries. This is undoubtedly true. Science cannot solve the ultimate mystery of nature. And that is because in the last analysis, we ourselves are part of nature and therefore part of the mystery that we are trying to solve. Music and art are, to an extent, also attempts to solve or at least to express the mystery. But to my mind, the more we progress with either, the more we are brought into harmony with all nature itself. And that is one of the great services of the individual.
And just say that last sentence again.
Yeah, and that is one of the great services of science to the individual. So
Great.
it is the way that counts and not the result.
Yes, it's the process.
Yeah.
Yeah, it brings you into this idea of tuning, right? That you can always tune yourself, just like civilization can always tune itself more perfectly to the laws of the universe, but never actually get the perfect tuning that couldn't be made better. It's very Leibnizian as well, that we live in the best of all possible worlds because it can always be made better. Not because it is perfect and static and crystallized, but it's because it has that ability to become better. That is why we are in the best of all possible worlds, which a lot of the Candide, Voltaire-loving cynics don't understand.
Yeah. The perfectibility
Yeah,
idea.
yeah, yeah, exactly. Goethe once said that the highest achievement to which the human mind can attain is an attitude of wonder before the elemental phenomena of nature.
Yes, we are always being brought face to face with the irrational. Else we couldn't have faith. And if we did not have faith, but could solve every puzzle in life by an application of the human reason, what an unbearable burden life would be. We should have no art and no music and no wonderman. And we should have no science, not only because science would thereby lose its chief attraction for its followers, namely the pursuit of the unknowable, but also because science would lose the cornerstone of its own structure, which is the direct perception of consciousness of the existence of external reality. As Einstein has said, you could not be a scientist if you did not know that the external world existed in reality.
Could you just restate as Einstein? Because sometimes your voice, it just cuts off once every like maybe 5 minutes, but just that
Okay,
one sentence as
okay,
Einstein.
sure. Oh, sure. As Einstein has said, you could not be a scientist if you did not know that the external world existed in reality. But that knowledge is not gained by any process of reasoning. It is a direct perception, and therefore, in its nature, akin to what we call faith. It is a metaphysical belief. Now, that is something which the skeptic questions in regard to religion, but it is the name in regard to science. However,
This you said the name or the same?
it is the same. Oh, sorry, the
Yeah.
same in regard of to science. However, there is this to be said in favor of theoretical physics, that it is a very active science and does make an appeal to the lay imagination. In that way, it may, to some extent, satisfy the metaphysical hunger which religion does not seem capable of, of satisfying uh, nowadays. But this would be entirely by stimulating the religious reaction indirectly. Science as such can never really take the place of religion. This is explained in the penultimate chapter of the book.
I'm not sure which book he's referring to here.
Well, why? I think that he referring to the last chapter we just read, Philosophy of Science.
He can't, because that hasn't happened until 3 years into the future.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah.
So it must be which one then? Uh,
Maybe he's speaking more poetically, like metaphorically, maybe about the book of creation or something.
Yeah, maybe that's a good explanation at least.
Okay, let's put that one on pause. But the idea is solid so far.
Yeah.
That even though science participates in the quality of faith, it could never fully replace, nor would we want it to replace religion. Although you can't extract the question of metaphysics and belief and faith in an external created reality from science.
Well, I don't know if we can discuss it just 30 seconds.
Sure.
But I think that for certain people, I think that science can replace religion in the sense that we need what I would call a third floor or a fourth floor in our lives. Okay, the first floor being the everyday chores and so on, and for certain person, philosophy or literature or ideas would give them that kind of higher life, if you want, and because what we call ordinarily as religion has a dimension that we call soteriological, which is a fancy word for salvation. Okay, and but salvation after our death, and I think that literature, philosophy, and science can give you that kind of salvation in the sense that it uplifts you life to a higher degree of energy or of reality. And the salvation precisely is in the pleasure of understanding things, or as Henri Poincaré said in some pages just before, that the endeavor of science is pushed by discovery of the beauty of nature, for example. Okay, and I think that that kind of thing can be a quite good substitute for religion, maybe not for everyone, but for certain people.
I see what you're saying. Yeah. No, I think if you define it that way, which is tied to love, like love of the creation, love of the undiscovered because you want to discover it, love of other people, love of yourself. If you have all of those sentiments being awoken, and everything you just said, then yeah, I guess I could see how you're thinking.
Yeah. I'm referring to the definition of agape by Mike Bullington in his famous paper that we read some weeks ago.
Yeah, right. Yeah, if that's there, I think that there's solid ground for what you just said. Okay, yeah. Any other thoughts, or should Murphy keep on? Murphy. Okay. And now for the second part of the question, that of the direction in which the traditional formulation of the causality principle may be revised. Einstein talks about the development of our faculties of perception as science goes on.
What exactly does he mean?
Perhaps I had better put it in my own way. Take, for instance, the modern phenomenon of speed. 50 years ago, the average tempo of locomotion was that of a trotting horse. Now it is even more than that of the railway train. If we strike a mean between the railway train and the motor car and the aeroplane, we had better say 60 miles an hour instead of 60 miles 60 miles an hour instead of 6 miles an hour, as in the days of the horse locomotion. You remember when bicycles first became popular, people were running down children and women on the roads day after day. Now you could not run down your grandmother with a bicycle. She'd be out of the way too quickly. You remember that when motors first careered off of the roads, the horses took fright. Now even the horses have developed their faculties to harmonize their perceptions with the idea of the new speed. Oh, I see. Yeah. Yeah, like so cars, when cars just appeared, horses were freaked out, but over time, cars and horses, like horses started to not be afraid when they'd see more and more cars and they got used to them. So he's saying that their perceptions harmonized with this new reality, this new idea of speed that previously the grandparent or great grandparent horses were afraid of. There can be no doubt but that modern mankind has developed some faculty or other in regards to this new phenomenon of speed. Now, I think Einstein's idea is that this sort of thing will go on developing and that scientists will rise who will have a much keener perception than the scientists of today. They will, of course, also have more delicate instruments. But the point is that what we need to develop are the perceptive faculties themselves. It may be that a race of scientists trained in the laboratory will be able to eventually to perceive the profound and manifold operation of causation in nature, just as the great musical genius perceives inner harmonies, which the Philistine cannot even dream of, and just as the music lover can perceive keenly the beauty of a Beethoven symphonic structure, which the peasant could not appreciate at all, because he is accustomed only to his simple folk music. The development of the powers of perception, therefore, is one of the main tasks we have to meet. That seems to be Einstein's idea.
Of course, it is clear, there's no doubt whatsoever that the stage at which theoretical physics has now arrived is beyond the average human faculties, even beyond the faculties of the great discoverers themselves. What, however, you must remember is that even if we progress rapidly in the development of our powers of perception, we could not finally unravel nature's mystery. We could see the operation of causation, perhaps, in the finer activities of the atoms, just as on the own basis of the causal formulation in classical mechanics, we could perceive and make material images of all that was observed as occurring in nature. Where the discrepancy comes in today is not between nature and the principle of causality, but rather between the picture which we have made of nature and the realities in nature itself. Our picture is not in perfect accord with our observational results. And as I have pointed out over and over again, it is the advancing business of science to bring about a finer accord here. I'm convinced that the bringing about of that accord must take place not in the rejection of causality, but in a greater enlargement of the formula and a refinement of it so as to meet modern discoveries.
Bam. Yeah. So this was again 1932, and then Philosophy of Physics 1935. And both Planck, Einstein, when they're writing about their idea of reforming, of intervening upon the problems in science, it's not apolitical, right? Like they're both very, very integrated, self-aware beings who have a moral identity that they've cultivated for themselves that is intervening upon the degeneration politically into fascism was very evidently leading us towards a dark age. So that's an important thing for people to also keep in mind is how and why they did what they did and wrote what they wrote and thought what they thought. And one thing that just occurred to me as well is that Planck also, he had a student who created a new school of psychology. And one of his star students who talks about why he created the school, this branch of psychology, with two other gentlemen. His name was Curler. What's his first name? Geez, I'm forgetting his first name, but yeah, Wolfgang Köhler. And Köhler worked with Kurt Kofka and Max Wertheimer.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. The three of them created a school of Gestalt Psychology.
Yeah.
Which Köhler went on to describe around the same time that he had done this on the challenge of his teacher, Planck, who said that this had to be created in order to give scientists a better appreciation for what their mind was doing when it was coming to new ideas that were fruitful in science, that had a harmony between the objective laws of nature, of reality, and their own internal subjective steps of their mind. And by creating a science of that process, that was what Gestalt psychology was designed to originally do. Which you get when you read like the dialogues between Max Wertheimer and Einstein on the creative process, which is a beautiful little dialogue. And in Köhler's A Place of Value, or What is the Place of Value in a World of Facts, is another really good short book by Köhler, where he gets at this. As well as his other book is called Gestalt Psychology, which is very famous. He's written a lot of books, but yeah, really interesting, fruitful way of thinking. And then it becomes corrupted later on, right? There's other people who, after they die, they take over the Gestalt Psychology school, and it becomes more new agey, more brought into like the Esalen Institute, networks, the Transcendental Meditation networks, and it loses a lot of that foundational rigor.
Exact. Because the three guys you name, Köhler, Wertheimer, and Kafka, they were the true creators of Gestalt psychology, or the grandfather of that school, if you want. Because most of the people in the psychological universe would rather name Karl Jaspers, okay? But it's already a degenerate form at the level of Karl Jasper. Exactly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Wow. Well, what you just said about Gestalt psychology, it's much more, for me, a branch of epistemology, okay? Meaning the discovery of how the mind is working and how the mind is walking on the way of creativity and discovery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. And it's like how it relates to the senses. So it's this investigation of how the senses are useful, where they fail, where the mind, like, because they often focus a lot on like illusions, and how the mind will fill in gaps of images that have pieces missing, because the mind has this, because they're asking like, what does the mind do? Why is the mind is what they're asking. And you could look at all of these anomalies that you're like, if the mind was just a computer, it wouldn't be able to piece together a word that has like all these chunks broken off of it. And you could just see these little fractions of symbols that are called letters, but it's very clear what we're looking at. And it's because the mind can piece it together, but a computer would just not be able to process and understand what it actually is looking at. Or like
and
3D images, right, that look two-dimensional, and then you look at it long enough, and then you're like, oh shit, there's a 3D dinosaur in this random chaos. It's like a computer couldn't do that.
Well, I think that's precisely a small moment of creation that, because once again, Gestalt psychology, okay, psychology of the forms, okay. I'm coming back once again to Plato, okay. They are eternal forms in us that always will give a synthesis and they are continuous moments of small creations to bring about that general image of the universe.
That's well said. Yeah. Yeah, that the entire universe is expressed in the smallest of its parts. Again, that
Yes.
you're looking for it, you'll find it. Yeah. Which also gets us at the idea also of the monadology of Leibniz's monads.
Yeah. Well, I think that all the brilliant people on this world at every epochs of history, they turn around the same basic ideas.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'll send a little mini article called Creativity as a Fundamental Principle of the Universe. It's written by very interesting, somebody wrote a lot of very interesting articles. But I'll email out just to you guys, which introduces Gestalt psychology from this whole epistemological approach that we've been taking here, and what Quan said. It's a really nice little article, and I think it'll bridge nicely into next week when we're going to begin reading. What I'd like to do is read an amazing paper that I had published from an old friend of mine in 2013 called Venice versus Leibniz on the Battle of a Science of Physical Economy, going from like the 13th century all the way up until the 20th century, and the battle between the two different currents of scientific thought in the West. So that there's not one European current of thought from the Renaissance to the present. There's these two opposing currents, as we've been introduced to in various ways, that represent two different political worldviews. So this is a paper that just does the job in the best, most efficient way I've ever seen, with a lot of concrete examples of what were the scientific discoveries, how were they being fought over, how were the British imperialist schools being artificially created to steal and plagiarize fruitful ideas that were being made by other people like Kepler. He's going to really demonstrate a side of Isaac, an ugly, weird side of Isaac Newton that would surprise a lot of people. So that'll be probably 2 readings to get through that paper. And then after that, I think we should plunge into a seminal piece by Leibniz, probably his discourses on metaphysics. And then we'll see where it goes. Maybe some Vernadsky. I know Jerry has a hankering for some Edgar Allan Poe at some point, so I think that might be on the horizon. But definitely we'll.
Yes, the one story.
I think we'll work. Well, I think at a certain point we'll work in some literature. Yeah, I think some Shakespeare, some Poe might be a fun. Maybe some Shelley might be some fun stuff to read down the line. So, all right. So tune in next week. Anybody else who might be listening and wants to be involved in these readings, they can just send us an email at info@risingtidefoundation.net. Next week would be a great time to jump on board, and check out the links in the description box for more follow-up work. Until then. So, amigos,
Okay.
bid you all adieu.
Ciao.
Okay, ciao.
Bye.
Till